Welcome to Hartford Seminary. I'm Dr. David Grafton, the Interim Academic Dean and Professor of Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations. It's a delight to have you all here this evening for part of this Shi'i lecture series. So for those of you who are not familiar with Hartford Seminary, the seminary goes back to 1834, and we're a graduate school for religious and theological studies. And our students come from many walks of life and different faith traditions, but primarily are Christian, Muslim, and Jewish. We prepare our students to become religious leaders in the complex and pluralistic society in which we live. So if you would like to take the opportunity at some point to look at our website and material out in the lobby, we have a table there with our degree programs. Tonight's lecture is one of a series sponsored by the Imam Ali Chair for Shi'i Studies and Dialogue Among Islamic Legal Schools. So we're very thankful to the members of our Shi'i Advisory Committee who helped sponsor this. Our speaker for tonight, Dr. Muhammad Saga, is a PhD candidate in Islamic history and civilization at the University of Chicago, where he is also co-director of the Shi'i Studies Group and facilitates the university's annual Shi'i Studies Symposium. He is concurrently the Iran Project Coordinator at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and an editor for Sharia Source at the Islamic Legal Studies program at Harvard Law School. Mr. Saga's research focuses on the origins of Muslim sectarian identity and political institutions, early Islamic trans-regional religious movements and military organization, and the historical development of Islamic political thought. Previously, Mr. Saga was a visiting scholar at the Center for Middle East Studies at Harvard, working under the supervision of Professor Roy Motaheda on early Islamic dynastic military politics, and he has received an MA in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago. Mr. Saga travels frequently to the region and has studied extensively in Iran, including as a researcher at the University of Tehran. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Muhammad Saga.
Thank you, Dr. Grafton, for the introduction, and thank you to Hartford Seminary for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here at the first chair of Shi'i Studies at such an important institution with such a storied history of Christian-Muslim relations here at Hartford Seminary. I had the pleasure of being here a few years ago when Sayyid Ammar was here, so he's very much missed, and we hope he's able to come back soon. But it's a delight and it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you, Dr. Grafton, and thank you to Hartford and Susan for helping facilitate this. So the title of my talk today is Apocalypticism and the Mahdi in Early Islam. So between sectarian identity and political thought. So what I'll be discussing today is looking at the context, the historical and intellectual context of apocalyptic thought and notions regarding the Mahdi, and exactly what the Mahdi means, who he is, and the importance of leadership in Islamic political thought. On the 5th of January in the year 910, following the Fatimid conquest of Qayrawan and Raghada in North Africa, the Friday prayer sermons were read for the first time in the name of the new Fatimid Caliph, the Khalifa, commander of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'mineen, and notably the Mahdi, al-Imam al-Mahdi billah. A few decades prior to that, in 260-874 CE, another group of Shia in Samarra, Iraq, modern Iraq, claimed that the son of their 11th Imam, al-Hasan ibn Ali, Imam al-Askari, had gone into occultation. He was the awaited Mahdi, al-Mahdi al-Muntazir. In 132-749 CE, when a revolutionary army stormed Kufa, the Abbasids proclaimed a certain Abu Abbas as-Saffah as the founding caliph of their dynasty. And 3.5 decades later, the third Abbasid caliph al-Mahdi took the reins of power. Much later, in North Africa, in the 12th century CE, a certain Ibn Tumart sparked a revolution in North Africa and claimed to be the Mahdi. His Almohad revolution swept aside the dominant Almoravids and ruled significant portions of North Africa and Spain. Who is this Mahdi? And why do so many competing claimants exist? When most of us hear the name Mahdi, perhaps we think of the Abbasid or Fatimid caliphs who bore the title. Or for most Shia, they think of the present yet hidden and awaited Imam, al-Mahdi al-Muntazir. But as these previous examples demonstrate, Mahdism is a very broad concept stemming from the very beginning of the Islamic movement and prophetic mission of the Prophet Muhammad, and is applied to a range of figures, movements with heavy citations in the hadith literature. These facts raise several foundational questions. Should the idea of the Mahdi be treated as part of the eschatological literature, Malahim wa Fitan? Is it an issue relating to the hadith methodologies, ilm al-hadith, or is it an extension of the political history of Islam? In order to properly understand the importance of the Mahdi in Islamic thought, this paper argues that we should appreciate the development of Muslim understanding of the Mahdi as a triangulation of continually developing political events, namely specifically revolutionary activity, so the importance of revolutions in the Islamic world, intellectual developments, so if we think of how hadith crystallization happens, and also scholastic institutionalization and the process of canonization, and finally debates over the political theology of leadership. Regarding this last point in particular, Mahdism is important because of the primacy of debates over leadership in Islamic political thought, which is why the title of Mahdi is almost always interlinked with other leadership titles such as Khalifa and Amir al-Mu'mineen. Leaving out any of these primary influences on the understanding of the Mahdi will leave us an incomplete picture of how the idea of the Mahdi and its continuing importance until today colors the political and spiritual consciousness of Muslims across the world. The Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran explicitly establishes the Mahdi as the rightful leader of the Islamic Republic, and the Islamic Republic is simply a placeholder until his return. So it's not a concept that's frozen in history. It's very much alive today. So in the Constitution it says, در زبان غیبت حضرت ولی عصر عجل الله تعالی فرجه در جمهوری اسلامی ایران ولایت امر و امامت امت بر عهده فقیه عادل و با تقوا آگاه به زمان شجاع مدیر و مدبر است که طبق اصل 107 عهدهدار آن می‌گردد. So basically saying that the Islamic Republic is just we're here until the Imam comes back, right? So it's a placeholder system and it's moving towards actualizing the mission of the Mahdi. Etymologically, the term al-Mahdi is derived from the Arabic root hada, to guide, and can either mean the guided one or the guiding one. Although the form Mahdi does not, as in the exact word Mahdi, does not appear explicitly in the Quran, the root hada appears 316 times in 12 forms throughout the Quran. And the form muhtadi, muhtad, as in the guided one, and hadi, the guide, occurs over 20 instances. So in the Quran we have وَمَنْ يَحْدَ اللَّهُ فَهُوَ الْمُحْتَدِ. Whoever Allah guides, he is the rightly guided, in Surah Isra, in verse 97. In a parallel ayah in Surah A'raf, مَنْ يَحْدَ اللَّهُ فَهُوَ الْمُحْتَدِي. Again, in Surah A'raf, verse 168, whoever Allah sends astray, there is no guidance for him. مَنْ يُذِلُّ اللَّهُ فَلَا هَادِي لَهُ. Right? So it's whoever God is guiding or not guiding. That's the context in which these verses are revealed. Outside of the Quran, the term Mahdi is quite ubiquitous in the early period. We see its application to the four rightly guided caliphs, al-Khulafa al-Rashidun, al-Mahdiyun. Oftentimes we drop that last part, but that's part of they're the rightly guided ones, al-Mahdiyun. And in the Sunan of Ibn Majah, which is in the Sunan of Ibn Majah, one of the 6 canonical works of Sunni hadith. And we see the early poets, Hassan bin Thabit and Al-Jarir, use the term to eulogize the prophets Muhammad and Abraham respectively. Importantly, Al-Farazdaq, another very important early poet, uses the term in panegyric Umayyad court poetry to refer to the Caliph Al-Walid. The term is also used by the likes of Sulaiman bin Surad, the Sheikh of the Shia in Kufa, in reference to Imam Hussein after his death, who he refers to Al-Mahdi ibn al-Mahdi. So he's applying the term both to Al-Hussein, the third Imam, and his father Ali ibn Abi Talib. And the avenger of the blood of Imam Hussein, Al-Mukhtar ibn Abi Ubaid al-Thaqafi, famously uses the title Al-Mahdi for Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, who was Imam Ali's son from another mother other than Fatima. The term al-Mahdi therefore transcends sectarian bounds in Islam and can be appropriated by a wide spectrum of people, movements, and political theories across vast geographic space. The Umayyad caliphs are using the term Mahdi, right? So what we might think as being kind of a sectarian term used just by one group, the Shia, in reality, everyone's basically claiming it. Within Shiism in particular, the historical development of Shia movements should generally be understood as an interlinked phenomenon in which the changes in one group or faction reverberate across a broader spectrum. This can be clearly observed in competing terms and claims legitimacy amongst the Shia, including over the term al-Mahdi. At around the same time, the Abbasids, the Fatimids, the Qaramata, the Nusayris, and the 12er Imami Shia all claim to either represent or have the Mahdi amongst them. The importance of understanding how different groups define the Mahdi is quite important, as it offers us a unique window into the process of sectarian crystallization of Islam. Competing claims over the Mahdi represent leadership splits, which form an important axis of confessional splits within Islam. So basically, looking at how different groups are approaching the Mahdi and defining him can, I think, provide a lot of information about how sectarian splits within Islam are happening, because it's its own unique phenomenon within Islam that we can't necessarily, as we were talking earlier, take from a Christian context or another context. The debate over succession of the Prophet is, after all, said to be the basis for the Shia-Sunni split in Islam. This is debatable, of course, whether it's just the succession to the Prophet that's creating sectarian splits, but I think the basic idea holds, that it's debates over leadership, which are the main axis for which sectarianism or sectarian splits happen. So in this exploration will therefore extend into competing planes of legitimacy over leadership, and indirectly addresses intellectual and conceptual categories of heresy and apostasy, heterodoxy and orthodoxy in the early Islamic context, as these issues are inherently tied to confessional identity within Islam. Importantly, if Islam has no church or formal doctrine, how do apostasy and orthodoxy operate? To answer such questions requires a multi-methods approach, which situates intellectual and doctrinal developments in the institutions in the socio-political context. So most significantly, I think when it comes to the idea of the Mahdi, looking at the phenomenon of revolts and the establishment of political order, in which the debates over orthodoxy and the question of leadership were embedded. So looking at kind of how different groups chose to revolt, put their lives on the line in order to challenge the political hierarchy or the order is a very important sort of institution, I would argue, for looking at how, for understanding how the Mahdi is being approached. So sectarian identity and its formation are generally understudied and theorized within the secondary literature of early Islam. And when it comes to the conceptual category of identity, historians are consistently confronted with the problem of back projection. What does it mean to be a Shia or Sunni in the early period? As Fred Donner's work argues, identity for post-Muhammad believers, right? So instead of automatically assuming that they called themselves or consider themselves Muslim, if we consider them as post-Muhammad believers, he argues that it's subjugated to historiographical issues of later Muslims, interpreting their early history through an imperial lens. Okay, this is very obviously a very hot debate, but I think it's quite likely that the post-Muhammad believers movement constituted a monotheistic reform movement, which only began crystallizing as Muslims, as we understand Muslims. So not that they didn't necessarily consider themselves Muslims, they did, but what that meant, it was very different than what Muslim came to mean under the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik. And even with other terms such as Arab, thinking what did Arab mean in the early period? Which is used, Arab is used to refer to the Arabic-speaking tribes which originally coalesced under the Prophet and undertook the early conquests. Even the use of this term may be subject to the same ex post facto usage, which anachronistically paints these tribes and believers as Arab Muslim, right? So again, these could be issues of imperial identity, looking at Arab Muslims as ruling over a vast geographic space, which includes non-Arab, majority ethnicities, and then also defining Islam in an imperial political context. So this doesn't mean that Muslims didn't have an identity. It just means that what that identity meant could potentially be better understood if we look at it as a monotheistic reform movement. And the Quran is replete with that. I mean, it's about Tawheed, it's about all the prophets that came before, and even Surah Baqarah begins with this: know who came before you and accept what came before you. So such identity labels such as Muslim and Arab, while they're useful as referential markers, do nonetheless carry descriptive implications which influence our understanding of the post-Muhammad period, the early Islamic period. Further, traditional reliance on classical theological tracts and heresiographies, so kind of heresiographies being defining what sects are, relying on these to solve deeper and more complex questions on sectarian difference within Islam and within Shiism itself is insufficient, because these classical fields tend to abstract belief from historical and political sociology, and they reflect the contemporary beliefs of the time periods in which they are written. They are not necessarily accurate representations of the past. So we can't just pick up books of hadith or firaq that are looking at different or categorizing different Muslim groups and just assume that what they're saying necessarily actually reflects what's going on. In order to do that, I would argue that we have to triangulate that with looking at the historical and sociological context. While all the major Shia groups, the Ismailis, the Abbasids, the Twelvers, and the Zaydis, are of paramount importance, such a history would be incomplete without recognizing and taking into consideration the broader trajectory of Shia revolutionary movements. Starting from the Tawwabun in Kufa, following the murder of Hussein ibn Ali alayhi salam in 61-680, and the ensuing movement of the Kaysaniya. So looking also at the patterns of revolt and revolution in the Muslim world, and looking at it specifically within Shiism, starts with Imam Hussein, really, and it goes onward from there. And following that, we find the Kaysaniya revolts, the revolts of the Khurramiyya, which were overpowered by Abu Muslim and the Abbasids, the revolts of Muhammad Nafs al-Zakiyya, who comes from the Hassanid line, and Abdullah bin Muawiyah, a Talibid, and the uprising of Ali ibn Muhammad, an Alid claimant, leading the highly effective Zanj revolt. So you have also different groups of Shia who are claiming lineage from different sons of Imam Ali, for example, or not even just sons of Imam Ali, also the uncles of Imam Ali, the Talibids, right? Abu Talib, his sons that are not linked to Imam Ali, but rather to his father Abu Talib, are also very much on the playing field, and they are able to revolt. And even the Zanj revolt, it's a slave rebellion in southern Iraq, is led by someone claiming to be from a descendant of Imam Ali. All of these revolts must be taken note of due to the interlinked nature of revolutionary movements in the Islamic Near East, and the importance of taking the broader spectrum of movements into consideration when theorizing larger identity and power relationships. Further, by also incorporating the spectrum of sectarian movements within Islam, which have been meticulously noted in the hagiographical literature, so if we think of other splits within the Imami movement, so looking at groups that split off after the seventh Imam, the Waqifa, the Fathiyya. So each basically, especially from Imam Ja'far Sadiq onwards, the transition period between each of the Imams is also filled with a lot of different Shia movements. And most of these are no longer around. By looking at all of these, we can try to understand the larger relationship between a sectarian thought, identity, and revolution. And I'm mentioning these names and groups not in order to overwhelm with information and place names, but to rather provide a glimpse into the diversity and complexity of these real-world movements, which had significant impact on the development of ideas and ideology in the early Islamic period, something that's often lost in hindsight. It's important to note the ubiquitous nature of Mahdism in the early Islamic period is due to the fact that the Mahdi, I would argue, is an archetype. It's only because the idea of the Mahdi represents the ideals and hopes of an active Muslim consciousness, yearning for just leadership, and a guide that Mahdism can manifest in manifold persons and institutions throughout Islamic history. Okay, so who is the Mahdi? I mentioned some of the derivative roots linking the Mahdi to guidance, and he is a guide. But the most ubiquitous hadiths on the Mahdi is that he will fill the earth with justice. And in many variations, he will fill the earth with justice just as it had been filled with injustice and tyranny. يَمْلَأَ الْأَرْضَ عَدْلًا كَمَا مَلَأَتْ جَوْرًا وَظُلْمًا. So this is the most ubiquitous if we look across the different Islamic movements or hadiths across, like say Shia, Sunni, and other movements. This is the most ubiquitous. He will fill the earth with justice, just as it has been filled with injustice. Even if there's one day left on earth, this has to take place. The Mahdi, therefore, is positioned on the horizon of Muslim consciousness as the one who will rule justly, overseeing the ideal system. For the Shia, this means a continuation of the prophetic message which began with Adam on earth and continues through the chain of wilaya, the inner aspect of prophecy which today rests with the hidden imam. After all, the prophets were sent to guide mankind and establish justice through their words and deed. In fact, as one modern Grand Shia Ayatollah phrased it, if Mahdism didn't exist, it would mean that all the strenuous efforts of the holy prophets and their divine message was in vain. In other words, the mission of all the prophets, the friends of God, the awliya, and the divine guides would mean nothing for us now if they were not alive today through the figure and model of the Mahdi, who is a continuity of the same mission of prophecy and divine guidance that God has always provided humanity. The idea of an end-time savior is hardly specific to just Muslims. As an archetype, the idea of a leader who embodies true justice and the divine message, carrying it out to its full potential, is quite intrinsic to prophetic thought systems. And this idea is an ancient one indeed. In Zoroastrian thought, the Saoshyant, an eschatological figure with a virgin birth, was prophesied by Zoroaster. And in Judeo-Christian thought, the Messiah is, of course, of paramount importance. The deep Gnostic currents of southern Iraq and the Iranian plateau, particularly Manichaeism, undoubtedly also impacted how Muslims approached and imagined the end times, particularly Manichaean claims of the coming of Jesus and the appearance of the false Antichrist, Dajjal. The Mahdi, moreover, is but one title in a larger lexicon of larger leadership figures in the literature. So in addition to the Mahdi, we have all these other titles: the Qahtani, the Yamani, the Qurashi, As-Saffah, and Al-Mansur, and a lot of the Abbasid caliphs actually carry these titles, and that happens for a reason. Taking a broader look, the Mahdi can be divided into various archetypes in Islamic thought throughout time depending on how justice is viewed, including the Mahdi can be considered the archetype of the perfect man, al-insan al-kamil, that we see in a lot of philosophical and irfani mystical thought, and which is heavily developed by the likes of Ibn Arabi and his students, as well as many others. He can also be considered the spiritual guide and proof of Allah's guidance to mankind, the Hujjah, which is prominent in Twelver Shiism. And also he can be positioned as in the context of a savior of the end time, or an end times figure. So thinking about the term qa'im or the munji, who will of course come at the end of time to fill with, the earth with justice. These archetypes are not necessarily mutually exclusive, of course. The merging of these various strands into one person is what some strands of Irfani modern Twelver Shiism has tried to accomplish, but is a topic of active debate even within modern Twelver Shiism to this day. Historically, however, one of the paramount factors which impacted approaches to the Mahdi was without a doubt revolutionary activity. In particular, the Abbasid and later Fatimid empires bore explicit messianic ideology and claimed to harbor the person of the Mahdi, if not the general title and charisma of this figure. And other groups, as I mentioned before, include the Twelver Shia, the Qaramata, which were an Ismaili group, the Nusayri Alawis, which are today still in Syria. They also believe in the Mahdi, and authority figures claim to represent him. And importantly, the collection of the 6 canonical hadith works accepted by the Sunni law schools, as well as the Shia 4 books, accepted hadith books, all post-date the Abbasid revolution. And just as importantly, the wave of non-Abbasid revolutions which gripped the Muslim world in the name of the Mahdi. For the sake of brevity, not all of them will be discussed in detail here, but the main area of contention for these revolutions is foundationally over the all-important arena of leadership of the Muslim Ummah. What are the fault lines for determining leadership, and why is this field so contentious? As Hugh Kennedy contends, just as Christology drove sectarian fractures in the formative period of Christianity, debates over leadership played a similar role in Islam. However, doctrinal and ideological differences cannot solely explain how sectarian splits occur. After all, ideational challenges can always be absorbed or negotiated within a given thought structure. In other words, doctrinal difference of opinion over leadership of the Muslim Ummah, debates over the Mahdi, or other epistemic or theological issues do not necessarily in and of themselves lead to sectarianism. There can always be debates, there can always be difference of opinion within a school of thought. As is often the case, differences of opinion which emerge within a sect can be contained within that sect as a particular school of thought, or can lead to new effective reformulations of doctrine accepted by other members of that sect. In other words, sectarian genesis requires more than difference of opinion. They require divergent authority structures and hierarchies. Sectarianism is thus driven by both doctrinal challenges and by claims to interpretive leadership, and by claims to interpretive leadership. So both doctrinal difference and like a sociological difference and splits within leadership. It is the battles which occur between the representatives of a thought system, battles of authority, which ultimately translates into clearly delineated leadership hierarchies, and the phenomenon of sociological and institutional sectarian fractures. So having a challenge, a thought challenge, can only lead to sectarian fracture if there is an effective hierarchical split within the leadership of that sect. Central to this narrative, moreover, is the role and impact of the state, quote unquote, if we can call it a state, but a governance authority on Islamic thought, not just through their sponsorship of institutions such as the madrasa, such as scholarly institutions, but rather on how the legacy of state building impacts Muslim thinkers' approaches towards concepts such as the Mahdi. Before the victory of the Abbasid revolution in the year 132 Hijri or 749 CE, the highly impactful wave of revolutions with varying degrees of influence on notions of the Mahdi and just Islamic leadership included, as I mentioned before, the uprising of Mukhtar in Kufa, who uses the term al-Mahdi, the uprising of Muhammad Nafs Zakiyya, who and his brother Muhammad al-Mahdi in 763 CE, both of whom bore important leadership titles, and they came from the Hassanid line. The uprising of Abdullah ibn Muawiyah in 744, right before the victory of the Islamic Revolution, who was a Talibid, who came from the descent of Abu Talib, who claimed to inherit the wasiyah of Abu Hashim, the son of Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, and was contested by the Abbasids. Finally, there were important series of what scholars such as Patricia Crone have called nativist revolts in Iran, by the likes of Babak al-Khurrami, which carried an eclectic mix of Manichaean, Islamic, and potentially Buddhist elements, which were in part absorbed by the Abbasid general Abu Muslim. A particular hotspot of these nativist activities was in Khurasan in Central Asia. The point here is to paint a rich picture of the various socio-political movements which laid claim to the mantle of the Mahdi alongside various other leadership titles such as Mansur as-Safa and so on. All of these directly impacted how Muslims understood and interpreted the concept of the Mahdi, especially in what we call the primacy of political theology of leadership in Islamic thought. Especially important here, I would argue, is the role of victorious revolutionary movements' attempt to challenge rival claimants once they assume power. While the Abbasids certainly persecuted any armed uprising or preemptively persecuted any potential rival movements from the Ahlul Bayt or other groups, they were constrained by their very own ideological propaganda. They had to legitimize themselves as the rightful ones who deserved to rule based on the slogan which they carried, Ar-Rida min al-Muhammad, the chosen one, or the one that's the pleasing one from the family of the Prophet, which they championed in the period of revolutionary struggle. Their ultimate inability to convincingly legitimate themselves over the long run, I would argue, led to a crisis of legitimacy in the Muslim world, in which, as some scholars such as Patricia Crone argue, was filled with the institutionalization of the station of the scholars. An abstract and vague process as theorized in Crone's God's Caliph, no doubt, but one that I think correctly indicates a larger dominant challenge within Islam and other religions for that matter. In Ahmad Shamsi's masterful work, The Canonization of Islamic Law, he touches upon a similar yet not wholly divorced process in the canonization project of Ash-Shafi'i, thinking about the Shafi'i school of law, which he argues was an attempt to extricate tradition from revelation, to delegitimize the former as a primary mediator of the revealed message, and to enshrine the later as a fixed, clearly demarcated category. This process of canonization, so what he's talking about is canonization. How do you come up with the core of texts? This process of canonization, aimed at establishing a methodological system around which scholarly interpretation and advancements can occur, is also intimately tied, I would argue, to a parallel process of scholastic institutionalization. Attempts to establish systems to demarcate and regulate thought and interpretation, which is, of course, highly contextual in the social and political space under consideration. So who gets the right of interpreting, in other words? So these are these are socially rooted and politically rooted phenomena. For the Abbasids, they had to challenge and delegitimate the very people and ideas which propelled them into power in the first place. Like the Umayyads, they faced serious issues in defending themselves as the rightful heirs to the Prophet. The Abbasids, after all, were just one faction in a larger coalition facing the Umayyads. They were able to skillfully manipulate and eliminate other powerful coalition leaders, such as Abu Salama and Abu Muslim, who led the most powerful army factions, in order to establish a government. Their means of rising to power proved that they faced serious deficiencies in defending their right to leadership in the Muslim world vis-a-vis other branches of the family of the Prophet, in whose name they campaigned, al-Muhammad. Therefore, ideological alliances with other Muslim scholarly classes, resulted in a wave of purges and accusations of heresy against so-called Persian dualism and polytheism, zanadiqa. The shared esoteric beliefs between the Abbasids and other Shia factions therefore could be bifurcated into an orthodox Islam promoted by the state and scholarly allies, and unorthodox esoteric beliefs led by revolutionary persecuted underground elements. So basically, I mean, if you think of think of the Abbasids as part of the shared Shia revolutionary movement, which once they get into power, how do they defend themselves against people that could claim that they're more rightfully should be leading the Muslim world? Well, one way to do this is to start to define orthodoxy, and to sponsor scholarly classes, which can then come up with categories of excluding the other. But the way that they exclude is based on a shared understanding. So it goes through very deep shared beliefs, on esoteric shared beliefs. This is all by way of background to the primary text I would like to engage with today, and how we can approach the highly relevant work which challenges many of our notions on Mahdism and eschatology. The work in question, which I'm looking at, is called Kitab al-Malahim, is a truly unique work which has unfortunately been largely underappreciated in mainstream scholarship. The text invites us to rethink prior approaches towards Mahdism and brings new insights into the Malahim literature, end times literature, in the process opening new questions on what exactly sectarianism meant in the first 3 centuries of Islam. Although this work was known to exist, and Ibn al-Munadi, who is the author of this, he's been quoted in many later works, the only edition which has been edited was published in 1998. Shockingly and luckily, the editor, Abdul Karim al-Ughayli, was only able to obtain one manuscript of this work in the archives of Ayatollah Burujerdi in his library, which was copied by hand in 1855. This has caused him some explicit angst, the editor, since it's an editor's nightmare to have only one manuscript edition to work off of. But we should, of course, be grateful for this, for it to be published, and to take a glimpse into the incredible trajectory this work has had, especially as it's discovered in the library of a leading Twelver Grand Ayatollah in the mid-20th century. In modern scholarship, the only author in Western academia who has brought attention to Kitab al-Malahim of Ibn al-Munadi, who's the author of the work, is David Cook, who wrote about this in several of his works. But one of the issues is that in the secondary literature, a lot of the works that have been written are before this edition of this work has been published. So if we think of Crisis and Consolidation of Mudarrisi, Abdul Aziz Sajidina's works, and Jassim Hussein's works, which are the main works on occultation and Twelver Shi'ism, they actually are published before this work, which I'm looking at, was published. So basically, it's useful to update update the field with the findings of this work. So the author of this work, as I mentioned, is Ibn al-Munadi. We have varying degrees of biographical information about him from Khatib al-Baghdadi, Ibn Ya'la, al-Dahabi, and some others, all of whom are favorable towards him. There's a cross-denominational consensus on him, which is reflective of his appeal and unique character. From his honorifics, from his laqab, al-Muqarri and al-Hafiz, as well as statements from Ibn al-Nadim, we know that he was a specialist of the Quran and different readings of the Quran. Ibn al-Nadim also asserts that Ibn al-Munadi had over 120 writings in various disciplines attributed to him. And al-Ughayli, who is the Shia author who rediscovered this text, argues that he also has, in addition to his Quranic specialization, he's also a major scholar of Rijal or biographical sciences. Okay, let's skip some of that. A lot of details. So he's, although this author he comes from a scholarly family, they're Hanbalis, right? So, which are not generally considered very favorable towards Shiism in particular. So that's important. But we don't know if he's a Hanbali. His father's a Hanbali, and he probably was trained in Hanbali law, but it's not completely clear whether what group he is ascribed to. David Cook mentions that he calls him a pro-Alid, whatever we mean by that. But this is a very generic term. People say Tabari, Bukhari, and Muslim are also, and Muslim, the author, the hadith compilers are also pro-Alid, but I think we have to think about this category a little bit more critically. Personally, I see him as a highly complicated figure who cannot be easily boxed into any of the intellectual or sectarian categories we envision today. So while it may be correct to label Ibn Munadi as a Sunni in the sense that he accepts mainstream Sunni authorities such as Abu Huraira and accepts the order of the first four caliphs, and he includes hadith in their favor, but he is an independent scholar who challenges and does not accept the precedence of what came to be later canonized as the Sahasitta, as the six canonical works. So he's important because he's not in the six canonical works of Sunnism, and he has his own independent readings, some of which overlap, but some of which are different. He brings forth original hadiths not found elsewhere, and even in cases where the text parallels hadith found in Abu Dawood, such as saying that the offspring of the Mahdi will rule the earth and be the offspring of Fatima. He brings in different isnads and matans. So even the issue of the identity of the Mahdi is of course very important because we have all these different people claiming to be the Mahdi. One of the hadiths that's very ubiquitous is that the Mahdi will come from the line of Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet. So he brings in different chains of transmission for that. And this, despite the fact that he transmitted elsewhere from Abu Dawood and was clearly familiar with his work, Abu Dawood being one of the authors of the compilers of one of the six Sunni hadith books. So overall, although the work does not explicitly back 12 Shia claims for the Mahdi being the son of the 11th Imam, Imam Hassan al-Askari, and other doctrinally consistent positions, it is in many ways a compromised text, which significant sections can be acceptable to 12 audiences. Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi, the Safavid, the very famous Safavid scholar, basically has rediscovered this text and included a lot of it in his monumental Bahar al-Anwar. So he writes, we have interesting analysis from Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi about Ibn Munadi. And he writes on how Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi read Ibn Munadi, and that he found these hadith that the Mahdi will be the descendant of Fatima, and how the Mahdi will fill the earth with justice, and other information. Sorry, I'm just skipping some of the details about the edition and trying to get into the actual content of what he wrote. Ibn Munadi brings in a lot of interesting independent theories on who the Mahdi is. So he has first of all, he has a conception of a pluralistic number of Husaynid and Hassanid Mahdis. He said there's not just one Mahdi, there's going to be multiple Mahdis, both from the Husaynid and the Hassanid lines. He reconciles the idea of Jesus as the Messiah and the heavenly Mahdi, and even in the notion that the Mahdi is a descendant of Fatima, which is also found in Ibn Majah and Sunan Abi Dawood. Further, Ibn Munadi brings in truly unique hadith transmitted from the sixth Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, which states that the tablets of Moses, which came down to the Prophet in his debates, were given to Ali ibn Abi Talib. David Cook also interestingly points out that Ibn Munadi brings in legitimating traditions from the Cain and Abel stories, links them to the Persian kings, and traditions about Satih, the Kahin, touching on pre-Islamic Arabia, and also quite importantly from what he claims is the Book of Daniel, which was in circulation according to him, quote, amongst the Christians and Jews. In this rendering, the Book of Daniel gives a prophecy. So he brings in a long hadith that he says comes from the Book of Daniel, which I don't think actually came from the Book of Daniel, as scholars more qualified can comment on. He brings in a prophecy discussing the coming of the Sufyani, the appearance of the Mahdi and war with the Byzantines, the Dajjal, and description of the Messianic age. This is clearly an Islamic framing of legitimating tradition of the Ahl al-Kitab and seen as a positive marker to push forward the legitimacy of the hadiths found in his work Kitab al-Malahim. Ibn Munadi puts forth interesting theses on the Mahdi. Firstly, he does not follow 12 claims that the Mahdi will exclusively be from the line of al-Hussein, and he ascribes both Husaynid and Hassanid Mahdis, plural, to governing in the end times. So he's opening up the space in order to allow for more claimants. The pluralization of the Mahdi in this sense is unique to Ibn Munadi, although we find multiple references to the idea. One of these references can be found in the work of Nu'aym ibn Hammad in his 9th century work Kitab al-Fitan, which is one of probably the earliest work we have on end times literature, which has a fleeting reference that there will be two Mahdis from the Banu Abd al-Shams, one of them Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. So pluralization of the Mahdis from the Umayyads. An interesting later reference is also found in 12 Shia works, namely in Al-Imama wa Tabsira min al-Hayra of Ali ibn Hussein Abawi al-Qummi, the father of Sheikh Saduq, who compiled the impactful Kamal ad-Din in defense of 12 claims to the identity of the 12th Imam. In one of these hadiths, the 5th Imam, Muhammad al-Baqir, is asked whether Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, the Imam of the Kaysaniya, was an Imam. To which Imam Baqir responds, no, but he was a Mahdi. So you can be in a Mahdi without being an Imam as a general marker. And this is found in one of the primary 12 texts. Ibn Munadi, moreover, explicitly states that the Hasanid, which is a term not found elsewhere to my knowledge, although Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi also interestingly uses this term, but Ibn Munadi explicitly states that the Hasanid will initially defeat the Sufyanid in Mecca. Ibn Munadi quotes an uncharacteristically long single narrative he found in the book of Daniel, as I mentioned earlier, in which a descendant of Hassan ibn Ali, who will go by the name of Muhammad ibn Ali, will fight the Byzantines alongside Jesus and establish a just government. What's important about this name, Muhammad ibn Ali, which will be easy to just maybe skim over, but it's important because there are a lot of hadith which say that the name of the Mahdi will be the name of the Prophet, the exact name of the Prophet, which is Muhammad ibn Abdullah. So in that sense, he's providing other narrations to say that no, okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be Muhammad ibn Abdullah. It can be his name is Muhammad, which is basically there's a consensus on, but what his father's name is not necessarily is different. And in Al-Nu'aym's Kitab al-Fitan, the term Hasanid is not used. However, a hadith is related to the Prophet through Imam Ali, who said, the Prophet named Al-Hasan a Lord, Sayyid, and from his loins will emerge a man whose name is the name of your Prophet and who will fill the earth with justice just as it has been filled with injustice. Lastly, and very importantly, Ibn Munadi includes a new interesting thesis reconciling narrations that the Mahdi is Jesus the Messiah, which is what is found in some of the Sihah Sitta books and other mainstream Sunni works, which say that okay, actually the debates over the Mahdi and the Messiah are one, and it's Jesus, right? So he pushes back on this by saying that there's a heavenly Mahdi and an earthly Mahdi, and these are two separate figures. So in that case, we can accept Jesus as the heavenly Mahdi and the Messiah as one, but there's also an earthly Mahdi. The Twelvers, of course, see this as one person and differentiate the Mahdi from the Messiah, that Jesus will come and pray behind Imam al-Mahdi, who will ultimately be the leader in end times. So they separate these two figures. The independence of Ibn Munadi and the framing of his work can perhaps lead one to call his work a unique product produced between two eras, that of the late antique Near East and the more sectarian reified Islamic world. Ibn Munadi's book, in brief conclusion, is important as a marker of the transition from late antique currents and more general concepts and norms which Muslims had in a more reified and sectarian future, where these concepts became more delimited in more exclusionary ways. It represents attempts to reconcile conflicting narrations and even potentially provides us with creative ways to think about sectarian issues today. The fact that it is championed by a modern Twelver cleric and was utilized and preserved by clerics such as Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi and other leading scholars, including Ayatollah Burujerdi up until today, which is the only surviving copy, reflects the resonance of this work. This work remains to have across sectarian boundaries today. And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much. So I guess I'll field questions if there's any, or if, yeah, please, thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Question for clarification and then a follow-up. So you mentioned that the manuscript, first of all, the fact that you're working on the manuscript at this time in the research material is very important.
Very.
So the manuscript itself, you said, was 1855.
Yeah.
What have they? What dating do they have of the original source, and what region was it?
So Ibn Munadi died in the, I believe, 11th century, if I'm not mistaken. So spanning the 10th and 11th century CE. So the work is claiming to be back from them, Baghdad. if I'm not mistaken, I believe Baghdad in Iraq. So this is a very, from however many hundred years it's been since then to 1855, it's a long time, obviously. So it's a lot of it's a methodological problem of how do we know what's in this work is actually legitimate or if there hasn't been work, So that the problem with having just one manuscript means that we're unfortunately our hands are tied a bit. But I think most, if not everything, is pretty accurate, just because just being in the larger literature and seeing what's out there, it's the way that it's framed, the language does seem authentic to the time, and personally, I do think it's an authentic text for the most part. Thank you. Sure.
I know you said Iran was like a placeholder until Mahdi returns.
Yeah.
So are there factions in the government that are trying to get that momentum going, where like you have like the hardliners and the honors, and like what are some of the things they're doing to make that happen?
Right. So the question was, to repeat the question, I mentioned that in the beginning of the text that the Islamic Republic and the Constitution is a placeholder government for the Mahdi to return. So the question is, what factions inside Iran are actually what are they doing in order to realize that? So as you mentioned, a lot of the what we call hardliner factions or conservative factions, I think, are very much believe and informed by their messianic or Mahdi, trying to bring back create the grounds for the return of the Mahdi. So I think, especially if you look at kind of what the Revolutionary Guards are doing on the ground in places like Syria, which has a lot of eschatological significance in the literature. The IRGC, the Sepah, is really working hard, and they're informed by this very much. I mean, if you go to Iran and you talk to people who are part of the Sepah or Basij, which is a popular mobilization, they're trying to create sort of institutions that are in line with the Mahdiistic ideology. So you see that in other places, which I think the most immediate places where you could see that, places like in Iraq with the Hashd al-Shabi, with militias, in Yemen as well, which are Zaydis, but and also Hezbollah, Lebanon. So a lot of these militias, I think, are one of the primary areas in which this is happening. But I think generally, if you look at that conservative strand, for lack of a better term, or the theocrats, I think they're deeply informed by it, and they're trying to build institutions to make that happen.
You mentioned the meaning of the word Muslim changed with the Umayyad Caliphate.
Sure. So the question was about what do we mean by Muslim in the early period, and so there's a debate in the field which was mainly sparked by a work by Fred Donner, Muhammad and the Believers. So his book is about this thesis that it's incorrect to think about the first generation, the early generation, to think of that they thought themselves in an exclusionary sense as Muslims. Instead, they were mu'min, they were believers, and that the Prophet came in a monotheistic reform movement that appealed to the larger sort of strands in the Near East at that time. So. Later on, when Abd al-Malik, the Umayyads, when he started his reforms, he looked at he prioritized imperial or power objectives, which looked at creating like a class which could be excluded from other rival groups. So in order to increase his own legitimacy and power, to create more exclusionary titles and identity. So that's the basic argument. It's very hotly debated, but I think that there's something there that definitely needs to be up for debate, especially as we think about our own sectarian sort of circumstances today. Yes. Thank you.
There is a general belief in Shia that the Imam of Islam is Allah.
Yeah.
And some of the ulama, especially Sufi-oriented and very pious people, they claim that they have some communication.
Right.
Is that really true? And that's the case? How did they confirm it?
Yeah. So the question is, for mainstream 12 or Shias, the belief is that the Mahdi is still alive. He's the son of the 11th Imam. He's the 12th Imam that has gone into occultation. And that many people actually claim to be in contact, or have claimed to be in contact with the 12th Imam. I would say there are two different answers to this. One, from that more Sufi understanding or Irfani understanding, they look, from my understanding, is that they see the Mahdi as a physical figure that's present in the world, but also he's within believers as well, as in he's within the heart of believers, so that the more you build yourself and the higher you get, you become more aligned with the Mahdi. So you can have, so not necessarily in this realm, but you can have, there are multiple realms that are not just physical but also metaphysical. So in a metaphysical realm you can have contact with the Mahdi, and not just the Mahdi, other awliya, people who have wilaya. So I think some would answer this way, which is not verifiable, of course. It's you would have to take, judge that person individual cases on an individual basis, right? But the second way is if you don't sort of accept that more Irfani understanding, in physical contact. Some of the work of Omid Qaim Maqami looks at this, and he's published, I think his book will come out soon, and I believe what he argues is that over time, the idea that you could see the Imam became much more kind of contested within Shia hierarchies, because if you claim to have representation or to be in touch with the Mahdi, that kind of puts you above the scholarly class, because the scholars are claiming to have legitimacy in interpreting the Mahdi. So it's a question of authority or wilaya, which is a primary question in Shiism. So the scholars say they have wilaya, which is through, even the concept of wilayat faqih, through law, through interpreting law. So that's how they claim to represent the Mahdi. For others, and you can see that even with President Ahmadinejad in Iran today, he basically hinted, or other times that there was some communication there. There are people who try to go around that and claim direct representation. In terms of verification, I don't know if there's a way to really verify it, other than your own judgment. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, the Prophet. Exactly. But he's so Ibn Arabi also would claim that he had communication with the Prophet, as Dr. Shakir mentioned, because he's Shaheed, he doesn't die, right? So that he can be in contact. He can be in contact with all the awliya, according to that thought system, and that's very consistent within Sufi thought. Thank you.
Out of curiosity, Joel, our resident here,
yeah, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Working in your Bible, I can't help but ask about
I have a lot of questions for you, yeah.
the Daniel reference, and you mentioned something about finding it difficult to know.
Yeah.
Assuming you've looked at the editions to Daniel as well, or
Unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to actually cross-reference. I'm just assuming, just because he's using the term Sufyani and kind of mainstream Islamic referential markers, that I'm assuming that that's not language that's specifically used, unless he's interpreting certain variations of the Book of Daniel. But the Book of Daniel is it's referenced in so many other Islamic works as well. But in this instance, it's the end times of looking at the Sufyani, and it's a very long narration about kind of what exactly will happen in fights with the Byzantines and the Muslims at the end times. So for him, he has no issue with bringing it in, as in it's not like a sectarian no-no, to not include that. So yeah, I would have to kind of show you the actual text to see your thoughts on it, but
just as a point,
yeah.
so look at Daniel, maybe only now that
Yeah.
by the 3rd century, there were additions to Daniel that were accepted as scriptural for many Christian communities, and later those additions were not considered scriptural.
Okay, I see. Yeah. Yeah. It's a rich area. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. No, I'll take that's a good point. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming so much. And we have some food in the back, so help yourself. And you
Thank
can
you.
also talk Muhammad than they do for Dr. Such.
Thank you very much.